Flickering candlelight danced along the mirrored walls of the winter palace, where velvet-draped tables sagged under the weight of roasted meats and jeweled goblets. Nobles in heavy furs laughed too loudly, but their eyes betrayed unease. The music of balalaikas and viols could not drown the serpentine whispers slithering across the hall, rumors of czars cursed in their beds, of queens whose wombs became battlegrounds for dynasties, of brides broken before their wedding night. Behind the gilded curtains, priests muttered blessings even as they perpetuated the very sins they condemned. Midwives smuggled herbs to desperate women, their trembling hands hidden under rosaries. Daughters were locked away, guarded like relics, until their purity could be bartered for power. In Russia's gilded palaces, power was never just won with blood. It was traded, corrupted, and undone in the bedrooms of czars. Stay with us as we uncover the most bizarre and haunting sexual taboos of the Russian czars, secrets that shaped an empire and destroyed lives. From the moment a royal child first drew breath in Russia, their body was no longer their own. Born into dynasties where blood meant power, infants were measured not by innocence but by their value to the throne. Daughters were pawns to be bartered away in marriage contracts, sometimes betrothed before they could walk. Sons were scrutinized for strength, their tiny limbs handled like tools of empire, their worth bound to the promise of virility. Few embodied this truth more chillingly than Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible. Orphaned young, he grew up in a court where poison lingered in every cup and daggers whispered through the dark. Raised amid betrayal and violence, he learned before boyhood ended that cruelty and lust were twin instruments of survival. As he watched rivals murdered, starved, or humiliated, Ivan absorbed a lesson that would shape his reign. That power could be inflicted as much in the bedchamber as on the battlefield. For royal daughters, childhood was little gentler. Many were confined to harems, seclusion chambers meant to guard their purity. Windows were barred, contact with men forbidden. Only eunuchs and a handful of trusted maids were permitted to enter. These gilded prisons were designed to preserve virginity, a prized commodity that could anchor dynastic alliances. In truth, the young princesses became living reliquaries, their worth reduced to the unbroken state of their bodies. Virginity itself became a weapon of politics. Families staged inspections, midwives sworn to secrecy confirmed purity, and rumors of impropriety, sometimes fabricated, were enough to end a girl's future. Even more grotesque were the whispers that circulated within noble circles, incestuous unions suggested as ways to preserve the sacred bloodline. Whether carried out or not, the suggestion itself reflected a dynasty so obsessed with control that even the most forbidden bonds were contemplated in the name of power. This fixation on sexual control was more than private cruelty, it was a generational curse. From Ivan's twisted upbringing to the cloistered childhoods of Romanov princesses, the dynasty's children were molded not as individuals, but as symbols, their lives bent to the needs of empire. The lesson was carved early into their bones. Their bodies were property, their desires irrelevant, their fates predetermined by a throne that demanded obedience at any cost. It was a curse that would not only scar their childhoods, but echo through their adult lives. For in Russia's royal houses, innocence was never a sanctuary, it was a currency, and it was always collected. As Russian princes grew into men, their marriages became weapons sharper than any sword. The Romanovs perfected a spectacle both grotesque and humiliating, the bride show. In gilded halls, noblewomen were summoned from across the land, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, then paraded before the Tsar like cattle at market. They were examined not only for beauty but for teeth, skin, and hips, signs of fertility judged by the leering eyes of courtiers. A chosen bride might bask in a moment of triumph, but her fate was fragile. Too often, the girl who caught the Tsar's eye would fall suddenly ill, her cheeks flushed with mysterious fever, her body poisoned by rivals who sought to replace her. Behind these intrigues stood the heavy hand of the Church. The Orthodox clergy declared that infertility was no accident but a punishment from God. A queen who failed to bear sons was not merely pitied, she was condemned. Her body became a public text upon which divine judgment was read aloud. Every miscarriage whispered of sin. Every empty cradle was proof, not of medical misfortune, but of spiritual failure. And yet, even natural cycles of womanhood were cloaked in superstition. Menstruation was treated as unclean, spoken of only in secrecy. Midwives who sought to help women regulate fertility or soothe the agonies of miscarriages were branded as witches. If their herbs worked, they were accused of sorcery. If they failed, they were accused of conspiring with the devil. In such a climate, royal women bore not only the weight of expectation, but the terror of accusation. Princesses were promised in contracts sealed with wax and blood, but a single blemish could undo their value. A crooked spine, a childhood illness, even a rumor of infertility could dissolve alliances overnight. Girls raised in seclusion found themselves discarded before ever stepping into a marriage bed. They became ghosts of dynastic ambition, locked away in convents or left to wither in silence while fresher candidates were displayed. The irony was bitter. The survival of the dynasty depended entirely on reproduction, yet the very superstitions meant to protect it often sabotaged it. By poisoning rivals, by branding barren women as sinners, by silencing midwives with accusations of witchcraft, the court weakened its own future. The desperate hunger for heirs became a cycle of cruelty, where fear bred more fear, and children of the dynasty were raised already scarred by the failures of those who came before. The Tsars could command armies and dictate law, but they could not master the unseen mysteries of the human body. And so, in their desperation, they twisted those mysteries into curses, taboos, and rituals, tools that inflicted pain upon the very women who were expected to save the empire. In Russia's palaces, love was never the foundation of marriage. It was betrayal, suspicion, and fear that lay beneath the vows. And long before the wedding crowns were placed upon royal brows, the seeds of tragedy were already sown. Marriage in the Russian court was not merely a union of two souls, it was theater, ritual, and sacrifice. Orthodox weddings gleamed with spectacle. Choirs thundered hymns of chastity, incense curled through golden domes, and crowns of guilt were lowered onto trembling heads. Before God and empire, the Tsar and his chosen bride stood as symbols of salvation, their union blessed as a covenant not of love, but of dynastic survival. The people sang as though every vow secured the nation's future. But beyond the glittering ceremony, shadows lengthened. Behind the veil of grandeur lay chambers heavy with silence, where private horror festered. No figure embodied this duality more than Peter the Great. Celebrated as a modernizer who dragged Russia into the age of European power, Peter carried into his marriages a fury born of suspicion and cruelty. His first wife, Eudoxia, was discarded, confined to a convent after failing to embody his vision of obedience. Mistresses were taken and cast aside with little care, their worth measured only in temporary pleasure. Violence simmered beneath Peter's charm. Even his consort Catherine, once a humble maid elevated to empress, was not spared humiliation. Though she became the face of Russia's resilience, her life behind closed doors was marked by constant surveillance, her womb monitored as though it were a state institution. Each pregnancy was both triumph and terror, every miscarriage a whisper of political weakness. For the empire, fertility was never personal, it was a national crisis. A barren queen meant not simply disappointment, but catastrophe. When harvests failed, when war brought defeat, when plague tore through villages, the blame often found its way to the palace bedchamber. The queen's body became the scapegoat for empire-wide suffering. She was accused of angering God, of carrying hidden sins, of failing the nation by producing no sons. The despair of childlessness was compounded by the public weight of condemnation. The remedies, steeped in superstition, often bordered on grotesque. Physicians prescribed leeches to balance the body's humors, believing that bloodletting could restore potency. Potions brewed from bear bile, powdered antlers, and stag blood were forced upon rulers desperate for heirs. These concoctions reeked of death and decay, yet they were swallowed with the fervor of salvation. Midwives whispered other cures, slipping charms beneath pillows or mixing herbs into wine, their work both feared and condemned. If they succeeded, they were praised. If they failed, they were denounced as witches. Even more absurd were the beliefs of the rulers themselves. Some czars clung to the conviction that shaving their beards or bathing too often would weaken their virility. To preserve strength, they performed bizarre rituals, rubbing animal fat into their skin, sleeping on blood-stained sheets, or visiting holy relics believed to restore potency. These taboos, cloaked in the language of piety, only deepened the suffering of those bound to them. The clash between public grandeur and private despair was starkest for the women caught in its snare. To the crowds, they were radiant empresses, resplendent in jewels and brocade, walking beneath the golden domes of cathedrals. To themselves, they were prisoners, wombs watched by courtiers, their failures punished with exile, humiliation, or silence. Many lived in constant fear that a barren month or a failed pregnancy would not just shame them, it would end them. The men, too, were trapped. Though they sat upon thrones, their masculinity was measured by the most intimate of yardsticks. Every glance of suspicion, every whisper of impotence gnawed at their authority. They turned to superstition and cruelty, desperate to prove themselves more than mortal. In this way, the Russian monarchy was both dazzling and damned. Its weddings promised eternal salvation, while its bedchambers bred despair. And though crowns were gilded and hymns soared, the truth remained unshakable. The empire's fate rested not on battlefields or thrones, but on the frail bodies hidden behind locked doors. The pageantry of royal power could not conceal the rot that festered within. As generations of rulers passed, the Russian court sank deeper into paranoia and cruelty, its obsession with controlling flesh leading only to tragedy. No tale illustrates this descent more vividly than that of Ivan IV, remembered as Ivan the Terrible. In a fit of rage, he struck his pregnant daughter-in-law for appearing before him in clothing he deemed immodest. The blow caused her to miscarry. In that single act, Ivan extinguished not only an heir, but the fragile line of hope his dynasty clung to. The brutality was both personal and political, an emperor so enslaved by suspicion and wrath that he destroyed his own bloodline with his hands. The centuries did not soften such horrors. By the reign of Nicholas I, whispers of incest among noble families threatened to destabilize reputations and alliances. Rather than confront the corruption that lay at the heart of the aristocracy, Nicholas's court silenced the rumors with fire and iron. Rivals who dared to speak of such scandals were branded as heretics, exiled, or executed. Silence was preserved, but at the cost of truth. The empire preferred lies and blood to admitting the grotesque rot beneath its jeweled crown. Poison, too, became a weapon of both palace intrigue and intimate betrayal. Queens accused of adultery or of secret loyalties to rival families often fell ill in the dead of night. Their bodies wasted away with fever, their lips darkened with poison, while courtiers whispered prayers over their deathbeds. The official stories spoke of God's will or sudden sickness, but behind the closed curtains everyone knew. These deaths were engineered, punishments wrapped in piety. Even the men upon the throne were not immune. The sexual dysfunctions of rulers became the subject of gossip and fear. A czar's inability to father heirs was whispered of as a divine curse, a sign that heaven itself had withdrawn favor from his reign. To hide their weaknesses, rulers turned to grotesque remedies. Aphrodisiacs brewed from ground pearls, deer antler, and exotic roots arrived from every corner of the empire. Priests were summoned to bless bedchambers, their prayers tangled with the sweat and desperation of monarchs clinging to illusions of strength. Some rulers subjected themselves to humiliating rituals, fasting before bedding their wives, sleeping beneath relics, or drinking concoctions that left them more ill than healed. For the women, the despair was immeasurable. Those who conceived outside the rigid expectations of the dynasty were forced into silence through violence. Abortions were carried out in secrecy, the women weakened and broken, their suffering hidden to preserve appearances. Others, accused of whispered affairs, sometimes without proof, were condemned to imprisonment or forced into convents, their voices erased from history. These women, once draped in silks and jewels, ended their days in cold stone cloisters, remembered only as cautionary shadows. The irony was cruel beyond measure. These rulers, so obsessed with control of bodies, of bloodlines, of flesh, found themselves undone by that very obsession. Ivan's fury destroyed his heirs. Nicholas's silencing of scandal only deepened mistrust. Poison turned dynasties into graves, and paranoia left courts hollowed by fear. What they sought to preserve slipped like sand through their clenched fists. The dynasties that believed they could command the most private mysteries of life and desire ultimately lost command of their own survival. Their heirs dwindled, Their marriages collapsed into suspicion, and their reputations became inseparable from the cruelties they inflicted. By the end, the gilded palaces of Russia were no longer symbols of strength, but prisons echoing with the cries of broken brides, barren queens, and emperors tormented by their own impotence. Flesh had been made into a battlefield, and from that battlefield the empire emerged not victorious, but cursed. The last act of Russia's cursed dynasties was not written on battlefields or in treaties, but in the suffocating silence of their bedchambers. The empire that crowned its rulers as divine found them destroyed not by foreign armies, but by the whispers of scandal and the shadows of their own desires. Consider Peter III, remembered less for his crown than for his humiliation. Rumors spread through the court like wildfire of his impotence, of nights spent playing with toy soldiers instead of consummating his marriage, of a ruler mocked behind velvet curtains. In a world where a man's power was measured by his potency, Peter's failures became fatal. His wife, the ambitious and shrewd Catherine, understood that dynasties could fall as easily to ridicule as to war. She moved swiftly, gathering allies, whispering promises, until the palace turned against him. Overthrown in a coup that began in the bedroom, Peter's reign ended not with glory, but with disgrace. Catherine ascended as empress, her power rooted in the very weakness that had undone her husband. Paul I, Peter's ill-fated son, inherited not only the throne but the paranoia of a dynasty poisoned by whispers. His legitimacy was questioned from the start. Was he truly the heir or the child of his mother's rumored affairs? These doubts gnawed at him like rats in the walls of his mind. His reign was marked by erratic decrees, suspicion of everyone around him, and a desperate attempt to enforce obedience. But paranoia breeds enemies faster than loyalty. In the end, Paul's life ended as cruelly as his reign, strangled in his own bedroom by conspirators who had once bowed to him. The bedchamber that should have symbolized intimacy became his coffin, his final breath stolen beneath silken sheets. Such was the cruel irony of Russia's throne. These rulers imagined themselves as untouchable, blessed by God and feared by nations. Yet their undoing came from within, from gossip, from impotence, from the suffocating weight of sexual taboos that shackled their lives. They were not toppled by invading forces, but by secrets whispered in candlelight, by suspicions of betrayal, by the very intimacy they sought to control. In the end, the symbols of their downfall were hauntingly simple. A bed, once meant for heirs and alliances, became a battlefield of humiliation. A crown, once gleaming with divine promise, lay tarnished by scandal. And in the dim chamber of a palace, an empty throne sat beside an unmade bed, a single candle flickering lower and lower until its flame surrendered to darkness. The legacy of Russia's Tsars is one of contradiction. They forged an empire of staggering grandeur, palaces of gold, cathedrals that pierced the sky, armies that marched across continents. Yet behind the glittering facade lay wounds that never healed. Generations of rulers and queens were scarred not only by politics and war, but by the private obsessions that governed their most intimate lives. Women, in particular, were stripped of humanity and remembered only for what their bodies could or could not provide. Some were exalted for bearing heirs, others condemned for infertility, still more erased entirely when their lives ended in poison or exile. Their names became footnotes in dynastic chronicles, tied not to the choices they made, but to the scandals whispered about them. Even the rulers themselves, who wielded crowns and commanded armies, found their power brittle. A czar could be overthrown not by invading forces, but by rumors of impotence. A queen destroyed not by foreign intrigue, but by the betrayal of her own womb. The empire's stability was bound to the fragile mysteries of flesh, its greatest strength and deepest vulnerability entwined. This grotesque irony lingers as a cautionary tale. When power rests in the body becomes the battlefield. The palaces of the Tsars were not only monuments of stone, but prisons of expectation, their rulers shackled by superstition, paranoia, and the cruel demands of dynasty. History remembers Russia's Tsars for their victories, their reforms, their tragedies. Yet behind each gilded crown and jeweled robe lies another truth. That empire was undone as much by whispers in bedrooms as by blood spilled in war. The Russian Tsars built palaces of gold, but behind their curtains lay the curses of flesh, whispers of sin, and the quiet undoing of an empire.